Good morning, dear friends. Thank you all for being here on this delightful Monday morning, the 23rd of Tevis, the 27th of December. Just a few days left till 2021. Lots of people clogging all the local condos and congesting the streets. And we're here to take a little break, all the hustle and bustle, or maybe the lack thereof in some of the buildings, if their elevators are down, God forbid. And we're here to study Torah, to study the entire Talmud, one page, one line at a time. At the moment, we are studying the Shabbat. We are getting towards the end of chapter 10, Perek Asiri, the chapter of Hamatzniah. The bulk of Hamatzniah had to do with variations of carrying, what's carried, how carried, what does it look like? Is it too big, too small, usable, not useful? A conventional method of carrying or not. We pivoted to talk a little bit about shiurim, dimensions, from carrying to other matters of dimensions. But now we are firmly in another topic, the topic of the offshoot of goizes of shearing. And so animals in the temple would be shorn, and the wool would be used in the function of the temple, or sometimes the draperies needed to be cut or trimmed or shorn. And so plucking a hair, cutting a hair, cutting a nail, plucking a nail, all can be somewhat connected or somewhat similar to the act of shearing biological material off of livestock. The question is, how similar? How halachically similar is the act of grooming to the grooming and shearing of livestock? And that's really the crux of the different opinions that develop. Some say, listen, the act of shearing, goizes, is to remove biological material, hair, nails, or other things from the animal. And so if a person does it to their own person, well, it's exactly the same. Others say, no, shearing by definition is a precision act done with an implement. And so if you do it without an implement, it should be entirely permissible. Certainly, if it is mostly already detached, then it would be extremely removed from that act of shearing. That is the general, very vague and overarching discussion we've had this far. In other words, just to put it in different words, we are really discussing specific Tolda Shabbos prohibited activities, offshoots of the primary activities. And so, again, there are 39 activities that were done in the Mishkan. Those 39 activities are prohibited to be done on Shabbos. But in addition to the primary categories, there are spin-offs, offshoots, or associated activities that are biblically prohibited, but they are considered secondary or an offshoot of the primary malacha. And the question, which is a big question, and every act needs a conversation and a dialogue to see what the relationship between the primary and the secondary. And if an act is super removed from the primary, it might even not be considered a tulda. It might not be considered an offshoot. It might be entirely permissible on a biblical level. And maybe it is the rabbis who prohibited as a gezerah, as an extra decree to uphold and preserve Shabbos observance. That's been our discussion thus far. Yesterday, we had a micro session, and I want to thank all those that tuned in and put up with the shortness of it. We talked about, well, that was exactly what we talked about. We talked about if an item was mostly removed or partially removed and cutting, and that was our discussion. We looked into the Shulchan Aruch, and we found that ultimately this kind of severing of a nail and the like is pretty strongly discouraged because of a machlokes between Rashi and Tosfos, which were diametrically opposed. And if you're going to want to consider both perspectives, you're basically never allowed to detach a loose piece of skin. Of course, as always, our discussion here was halacha v'lo l'maaseh. This is the halachic flavor, but we weren't giving specific halachic advice, but we got the background, we got the perspective, and that was yesterday's Gemara. Today's Gemara is going to be somewhat of a pivot, because the second half of the Mishnah talked about other grooming activities that could be considered prohibited. So we talked about braiding and combing and makeup. And so we're going to talk about that. And then from there, we're going to move off to other tulda, other offshoot type activities that are not immediately present in the Mishkan. If we'd go in a time machine and go to the Mishkan, we would never see it. But it is considered related enough that it would be a tulda, an offshoot of those primary malachas. I think when we see it inside, you'll appreciate what I'm saying. So sit back, relax. We'll share the screen, and again, we dedicate our learning for the complete, speedy, total wellness of all the members of our chabura and their households, and in particular, we're going to mention Shmuel Zev ben Rachel Ita and Leah Bas Rita, Malka Bas Rivka, Chaim Baruch Eliezer ben Rusa, Esther, and Ludmila Bas Nejadai. Again, I'm not sure I'm saying that correctly, but the main thing is that we should have goodness, well-being, and good health for everyone. And they also want to mention today's the yahrzeit of a new friend, someone that lives in the area but just came by today, and he's observing yahrzeit for his father, Yitzchak ben Yechiel. And I told him we'll mention his father's name as we learn again. And now, let us jump into a new segment of the Talmud. Again, just to note, while I was giving my long preamble, I hit mute all, but I ask and encourage everyone to unmute so that we can hear and learn from one another. And so that is the request. That's the deal. And if anyone has any questions about what I said until now, please feel free to jump in. If not, we will begin a new Gemara or a new conversation. And again, thank you all for being along for the ride. Quoting the Mishnah. Our Mishnah says that one is braiding the hair could be a problem on Shabbos. Koicheles, applying. I'm sorry. Let's read this differently. Etc. Our Mishnah says that braiding, eyeshadow, blush, or possibly another kind of hair maintenance, those are prohibited. That's what the Mishnah says. Rabbi Eliezer says it was prohibited biblically. The Chachamim say that it is only rabbinic. Now the Gemara is going to analyze the statements of the Mishnah. Goideles, braiding, koicheles, kuchla, or I think we said kol, Kohl, right? Rebel, is that right? I think you were. So that is a pigment that exists in the modern day. You might be able to buy it in some packaged form in your local pharmacy.
Still an ingredient of eyeshadow.
Still a present ingredient of the eyeshadow. And so the Gemara wants to understand what exactly is wrong with braiding, what exactly is wrong with applying eyeshadow, and what exactly is wrong with brushing or poseket, whatever we decided, whatever Rashi or Tosfos decided the definition of those activities. Those activities are. Mishomai mechaiva. What is the problem with these activities? Shalom Aleichem. Amar Rabbi Avin taught Amar Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Chanina. Goideles, you know what's wrong with braiding hair? Mishum oire, I guess. It is uncomfortably similar to braiding, to weaving. On a very superficial level, let's think about it. Braiding hair is essentially weaving different bunches of hair to create some kind of design. And weaving is a similar motion of intertwining different pieces of thread or yarn or material. And so superficially, they are quite alike. And so maybe, and this is indeed the teaching of Rabbi Avin, or quoting Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Chanina, you can't braid hair because it's like weaving. Koicheles, why would one be restricted in applying eyeshadow? Mishum koiseves, you're applying pigment. I think sometimes the eye makeup comes in a pen or pencil-like it's applied in such a manner. It's kind of like koiseves. It's kind of like writing. Writing, you use an implement and you draw pigment in a line. So superficially, there's something quite similar. Rebel, you wanted to say something?
Didn't we have a discussion about tying knots on Shabbos somewhere?
Indeed, we did.
And braiding is more, to me, tying a knot. I thought that's what was coming.
So let's see. Braiding is well, let's see, because we're like there's, as we're going to see in a moment, there are different perspectives of what might be wrong with braiding, and we'll look in Rashi and he'll explain. And tying a knot was a separate melacha. So I don't want to mix it in at the moment, although you are correct that we could plausibly envision a parallel between braiding, or especially if there is some kind of knot-like movement. But let's leave it a little open-ended because we still have a lot of information to absorb, and let's see how the Gemara understands it. But again, superficially, we could imagine how a braid might look similar to a weave. Superficially, we can imagine how applying eyeshadow could look like writing. And not only it might look like, Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Chanina says that's why it's prohibited, because it's too similar. It's an offshoot. It's another application of the same idea. Poi keses. And what about the last activity, which Rabbi Steinsaltz here says applying blush. Rashi said, I think it was combing. We'll have to take a look in a moment. Poi sekes, or actually here it says poi keses, making putting on this blush, mishum toive, is similar to weaving. Hold on a moment. Let's see how Rabbi Steinsaltz explains it. Check this out. It's a little bit of a stretch, but let's look at Rabbi Steinsaltz and then we'll look at Rashi. A woman who applies blush is liable because of spinning. Now, what is the connection between spinning yarn and applying blush? So a woman would make a string from a doughy substance and pass it over their face to redden their complexion. This is a little bit of a stretch. Rashi doesn't like this interpretation. Tosfos, I believe, does. But long story short, why can't you braid? Why can't you put eyeshadow? Why can't you comb your hair? Well, because it's quite similar or somewhat similar and an offshoot of other malachas. That thus says Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina. Now let's take a look at Rashi. Mishum kaiseves, shemaylicha mikchol saviv ha'ayin. The eyeshadow applicator. Is that the right word? Sure. Let's say, okay. The thing that you use to apply the eyeshadow is applied to the eye.
A wand.
A wand? Okay,
yeah.
The wand which applies the eyeshadow around the eye is ke'adam ha'maylich kulmos saviv ha'os. It is akin to the way a person wields a quill around the letter to form the letter. And so the motion, the movement, it's too similar. It's not identical. Conceptually, the purpose is a good bit different, but it is similar enough, says Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina, that we're going to prohibit it. Toive, what is the similarity between poi? I could have sworn the word the Mishnah used was poi sekes. No, I read it wrong. Poi keses. All right. Toive shemisakenes sara bein etzba oiseha. Why is spinning yarn similar to combing the hair? That we can imagine. Because what would happen was you had this raw wool and you would have to slowly spin it, smooth it, and channel it to be smooth and uniform. And when you comb hair, when a person combs the hair either with their hand or even with the combs of a brush, and you smooth it out and you remove all clumps and wrinkles and knots. When it is all, what's the right word? When it's all mixed together, the lashon hasheni oisama oisei batzek kimin chut. Then Rashi says there is another interpretation, and if that's the case, if you're saying that a poikeses means putting some kind of application, well then it's because they would turn this dough into a string-like motion and then they would use it to apply. I think the first interpretation is a lot more pshat and easier for us to appreciate. But there you have the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina, why our Mishnah enumerates a prohibition, either rabbinic or biblical, for braiding, eyeshadow, and combing. Tosfos is going to discuss or re-emphasize a debate that existed already in the Mishnah about the identity of the word pokeset. Masha pirish bakontras pokeset haino sorokat biyad what Rashi says, which the word pokeset means combing either with your hand, or with a comb. Ein nira. This does not sound like this is. He says, I don't like this answer. The Gemara mashma the hevek ein tevia, because the Gemara says that there's a parallel between the act of pokeset and spinning. I'm sorry, combing. I think I misspoke. And combing. Usrika eina ke'ein tevia klal. There's nothing similar to brushing hair and spinning yarn. So basically, Tosfos says, if the word pokeset means combing, you would have just used the Hebrew word for combing. Number two, the Gemara's commentary and analogy between combing and spinning, there's nothing in common. Whereas if you are spinning dough to become the applicator, to use it to apply, so at least it's the same motion. There's something similar. I still see more of a commonality. Between brushing and smoothing out and working material than dough. But anyways, that's the machlokes that Rashi and Tosfos.
I always thought you pull out too many hairs. You're actually pulling it.
Possibly. We're still in the middle of a developing. This is a breaking news. This is still developing, a developing story. So we'll wait and see what the bottom line is. So continues the Gemara. We're going to see some funny expressions. The rabbis say in the presence of Rabbi Avua on this subject. V'chiderech ariga b'kach. Is there really anything in common? Is this truly how weaving happens? Think about how a braid works. Superficially, there's something similar, but it's very different. V'chiderech ksiva b'kach. Is this really how writing works? And because of this Gemara, that's why I was very tentative in my original interpretation of the earlier things. V'chiderech ksiva b'kach is what we're describing here with what you're doing with the hair, according to Rashi, or the application of blush. Is that really similar to Tviyah? And so basically, the Chachamim tell Rabbi Avahu, who I believe was a contemporary of Rabbi Avin, we don't like this interpretation. Elo Amar Rabbi Avahu says, indeed, Lididi mifarshali minei Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina, I have a very different record of the very words of Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. I understand it differently. The activities are prohibited, but for different reasons. And so essentially we have a machlokes. I believe these were two students. These were two colleagues, Rabbi Avahu and Rabbi Avin, who both had a Masorah in the name of Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. But the specifics of the explanation, Rabbi Avahu has differently recorded than Rabbi Avin. Let's see what Rabbi Avahu says, and then we'll try to figure out how this discrepancy could have arisen. Any comments before we continue? You know, hold on, let's take a look at Tosfos. The Gemara says, is there really a good comparison between braiding and weaving? So he says, although braiding is, if you would do a braiding motion in the weaving process, that might be considered weaving. If you're using fibers that are typically used in garments and you braid it, that might be considered weaving. But if you're using human hair, the braiding of human hair is not done for the purpose of a permanent item. A garment is meant, once you weave a garment, it's meant to stay that way. Let's think about what happens to a braid. Does a person want a braid to be a perpetual, in perpetuity? Is that how the hair is supposed to remain? No. A hair braid is a temporary treatment of the hair. And as opposed to weaving, which is for the purpose of creating a permanent garment or a permanent accessory. And so Tosfos helps us understand why, in truth, although superficially Braiding is putting different hair fibers in a certain way, but deeper and in truth, there's no comparison. And now let's see why Rabbi Avahu says the same three activities are prohibited. You know what's wrong with applying eyeshadow? Mishum tzayvas, it's like dyeing. Because what's dyeing? Applying pigment. And what's eyeshadow? You're applying pigment to your skin. Gedelas, you know why you're not allowed to do gedelas or pesekas? You know why a person is restricted from braiding and brushing? Mishum baina, it is something like building, creating a structure. Now, folks, is braiding really like building? So the Gemara says, is this really building? The Gemara says, in the construction process, there are times that braiding happens. Now, I want to say something interesting. Certain parts of construction, maybe certain cables are or were woven, or certain kinds of thatch roofing units were woven. And so I think that's what's happening over here. I'd love to hear your opinion. This is something that I'm a little bit more open to hearing. But the Gemara is saying, do we find in the construction process that weaving is employed? And the Gemara says, yes, indeed. But I want to remind you something else. When we say baina, the definition of baina in the context of Shabbos is not only construction in the literal sense, but it's making stuff, making things. And so the Gemara says, indeed, we find that there is a description. The Torah describes the act of braiding as baina, building. And here's going to be a little bit of a shocking and counterintuitive statement. The Torah talks about how Hashem built Adam from Chava. So let's for a moment forget that we're talking about Shabbos and Malachis, and let's go back in time to the very first human, Adam, and the second human, Chava. Or maybe I should say the first lady. Vayiva and Hashem Elokim es hatzela. Hashem created Chava, and it's described as Hashem building out a side, the side. Sometimes we describe it as a tail or an extra rib, or the Medrash describes how in truth Adam and Chava were both created fully formed, but perhaps there were some kind of Siamese twin kind of arrangement, and Hashem separates Chava from Adam. But the words the Torah uses that Hashem built es hatzela. He built, and again here Rav Steinsaltz translates sela to mean side or rib. Milamed, Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh took this verse to mean something that you probably never heard before. Shekila HaKadosh Baruch Hu leChava. Hashem not only operated on Adam to separate Chava, not only made Chava come into existence, but Hashem also adorned Chava with a hairdo. Milamed Shekila HaKadosh Baruch Hu leChava. Hashem even gave Chava a hairdo. Hashem made up her hair. She came bekrachayim karim lekala isa bin yasa. And indeed, the word binyan, bin yasa, is similar to the word of a hair braid. And so, in other words, the word binyan, which means construction or creation or something new, can be extended according to our Gemara, according to Rabbi Avahu, can be extended to hair braids. Okay, that's an opinion. That's an opinion in the Gemara that says that braiding is prohibited because it's like baina. So much so that we actually use a similar word in the Torah and in common parlance in the Krachei Hayam, in the seafaring zones. By the way, before we go back to our Gemara, Adam and Chava were getting married in a sense. And so here we see that there's the Kala I mean, it's also a no-brainer. Obviously, the chassan and kala should both be as put together and suputzt and presentable for a wedding. But here we see that Hashem was involved in taking care of a kala to make sure that she was presentable to the maximum. And so this might be another source that reminds us, if Hashem is willing to get involved in preparing a kala and making sure that she looks the way she wants to be on her wedding day, then certainly it underscores the mitzvah of hachnasas kala to make sure that particularly a kala and a chassan as well have their wedding in the most ideal manner that they can hope for. Tanya, just to finish the subject, and then we can go back and discuss some more, because I'm sure we want to discuss this. Tanya Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar presents a slightly nuanced or different opinion. These three activities enumerated in the Mishnah. I'm sorry, I should say this is a reframing of the same teaching in the Mishnah. The act of braiding, applying eyeshadow, eyeliner, and poikeses, and combing, la'atzma p'tura. A person does it to themselves, they are not considered to have transgressed a biblical prohibition. However, lechaverta, if you do it for your friend, chayeves. Let's think why. Because remember, we said when you do things for yourself, it's going to be less precision, particularly in a time where there were no mirrors. It would be very hard to do a perfect job on oneself. But if you do it to your friend, you're doing it more in a professional and precision method. And so then, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar, that would be prohibited. And similarly, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar would say, Isha women should not also put surak, which I believe we're going to say here is rouge, some kind of blush, because that also is soiveya, that is also like dyeing one's skin, even though it's not permanent, but that's what the Gemara says. So, is one allowed to do these activities? The Mishnah says no. The question is why? Is it biblical or rabbinic? The Mishnah quotes Rabbi Shimon as teaching. No, I'm sorry. Our Mishnah says, Rabbi Eliezer says that it is a biblical prohibition. The Chachamim say it is only the Rabbanan. And here, Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar added even more, that the prohibition is primarily when you do it for one's friend. So we're left here with a Mishnah and a Gemara that teaches us that certain activities about how a person is made up, how do we call it? Certain parts of grooving or whatever may be prohibited on Shabbos, as our Gemara here discusses and analyzes. Although they aren't primary present activities in the Mishkan, there are two different versions of how they are quite similar to activities that indeed were in the Mishkan. So we have a few things we need to discuss. The first thing I want to discuss here, and this is all open to discussion, is how do we have a scenario where Rabbi Avin and Rabbi Abahu, which were perhaps in the same room hearing the same teaching, how do they each have radically different interpretations of what's wrong with these three activities in the Mishnah? Any theories? How can you have two people in the same room and hear two totally separate things? Well, the first thing I guess we could say is that happens sometimes. You have two people sitting in the same presentation or having the same conversation, and each one walks away thinking that they heard something entirely different. So first of all, that's not unheard of. But let's understand this a little further. What's going on over here? So here's what I'm thinking. Probably, and again, I may be wrong, but probably the words that were actually recited by Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina was, these three activities, they are very similar to Malachis in the Mishkan. Rabbi Avin immediately said, oh yeah, I know which they're similar to. And he thought of three very, very similar Malachis: braiding and weaving, applying and writing, and combing and spinning. Rabbi Abahu disagreed. He said, no, although they look similar, they're very different conceptually. And so he found three other malachis that, although maybe if you take a snapshot, they look more different, but in their underlying purpose, they're more similar. And so we might say the machlokes is, what is the relationship? And again, this is a little bit ad-libbing. So again, there's a lot of scholarship about this, but I just want to give you my basic impression. You might say, is the tulda superficially similar, or is the thematic, is the idea, is the concept of the malacha similarity? Is that what makes it told? And perhaps that's the machlokes, simply put, between Rav Avin and Rabbi Abahu in the interpretation of the words of Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina. But no one disagrees that these activities are prohibited because that's what the Mishnah says. So they're debating with the Mishnah, but merely the interpretation of the Mishnah. Where the halachic application gets a little more complicated is with defining the exact parameters and the definition of each of these activities. But suffice it to say, I believe the default teaching, if you're going to go to a Shabbos class, would be and again, I hope I'm not ruining anyone's day, but one shouldn't really apply makeup on Shabbos. And this, because of that, there's a whole industry of long in the religious circles of long. Again, this discussion is not halacha l'maisa. I'm not telling anyone here a psak of how they should observe Shabbos. If their own rabbi or posek told them to do something differently, this is more of the theory of halacha. But there's a whole industry. Dr. Hammer's on, I'm sure he'll get a kick out of this, like our long-standing discussion about different industries that are built out of halachic problems. But there's a whole industry or a great interest in the Haredi and religious world about long-lasting makeup that can endure because of the complications with applying makeup. And then, of course, it's all the other sacrifices that some people choose to make for beauty about how they sleep and if they're going to impact their makeup. But suffice it to say, this is a challenge that is presented halachically. And then also what one does to the hair as well could be complicated. So now you have to decide: do you want to protect your makeup, or do you want to protect your hairdo? And that puts one in making difficult choices. But anyways, that's what it comes out of. Yes.
Well, I think one of the problems is that, particularly in the religious community, the ultra-religious community, you could witness in any Jerusalem hotel on Thursday night, a shidduch date where the potential kala is all decked out. She probably went to a fancy salon to have not only her hair done, but her face done. And you don't want the next time that he happens to meet her, because they told the family davens in such a shul to go and look behind mechitza and not see this beautiful kala that he went out with. There's no one that looks anything like her because she doesn't have makeup on now. Okay, so the answer to that is to be on the more liberal side of the Orthodox stream, and to look for natural beauty both inwardly and outwardly in a shidduch, and then you have no problem. You have whether she's swimming or playing tennis or going to shul, doesn't need any makeup, and beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. So, but anyway, I understand that an industry was built around that. And I think
be very careful, Bernie. I come from that industry.
Well, first of all, Dr. Hammer, your words are strongly endorsed. Indeed, a rebel. This is your industry.
It may be makeup to you, but it was bread and butter to me. Rabbi, I don't know if I caught in the exchange here, was one of the criteria whether what you did was permanent or temporary?
So I'm going to reframe your comment because that's a good question. I quoted Tosfos, who challenged the analogy between braiding and weaving. And the challenge to that analogy, the way Tosfos presents it, is simple. Weaving is to make a garment. That is a long-term, permanent creation, right? When you weave a garment or piece of material, this isn't a temporary activity. The intention is that this piece of material should live long and prosper. And so you don't intend for this thing to become undone and reused. Whereas when a person braids the hair, it is by definition a fairly temporary proposition, and in short order, it'll be redone. And that's how we give business to all the hairdressers and the folks that do professional, hair. No, but that's the nature of hair. And so it's not a permanent activity. That was the challenge to Rabbi Avin's interpretation here. I'm just going to zoom up for a moment, where we said
that's exactly my problem. Are you going to be able to claim that what you did, whatever it is, was temporary, therefore you shouldn't have to consider it midoraisa, or at least
that's the Gemara's challenge presented in the first go, but with Rabbi Avahu's interpretation, we don't find the Gemara making that claim that it is not identical, and therefore we do not seem to have a heter, if you will, for temporary application or temporary making of the hair. So again, I just want to show you the Gemara inside. Kochelet mishum tzovat. The eye shadow or the whatever makeup is being applied to the eye is similar to dyeing. And godelet upokeset, the activities done with the hair, is related to the item of baina, making, building. And for some reason here, the Gemara doesn't seem to say that you cannot compare baina, building, something that's permanent, to doing hair, which is temporary. The Gemara doesn't make that case. The Gemara does make that case when contrasting braiding and weaving. Perhaps the reason why the Gemara can't make that case is because we find a biblical allusion and we find the reference to common language that we describe the doing of hair as a creation. Even if it's a temporary creation, because we define it as creation, it can be fit, according to this Gemara, into the class, into the category of baina, of building, even though usually we imagine that building construction is more of a permanent activity and making of hair is, we imagine, to be more of a temporary activity. So you are correct that we initially reject a comparison, or at least the Gemara challenges a comparison between weaving and braiding for that very reason, permanence versus a temporary activity. Unfortunately, for team braiding on Shabbos, the Gemara here doesn't seem to apply that same challenge. And so I think that's what your question was. It's a good question. I'm not going to tell you I'm entirely satisfied. I suspect it is discussed. And actually, let me take a look at our. I should also point out I failed to do so. We just turned the page. We're now on 95a. So we're a page further into our Talmud journey. Give me a moment here. We could ask another question, a similar question, which is what's going on? How do we use the word baina? How do we apply that to being on the person's person? Do we describe what's being done to a human as baina? And so the Meiri explains our Gemara that these activities, according to the Rabbanan, are not biblical. You know why they're not biblical? Because you can't really use the word building to talk about what you're doing to a person's hair. But the Rabbanan can prohibit it. But it would be shocking to make the case that this is actually biblical.
Rabbi, what I'm, I don't know if worried about is the right word, but if you were, let's say, to carry something which you know is going to disappear while you're carrying it,
Mm-hmm.
would you be able to play this game?
But explain to me
Well,
practically.
I could see a situation where somebody wants to move, in the old days, an ice block. You know,
Well, if you move the ice block and it melted, then you probably have no gain from moving it.
No, but maybe you wanted to get out of the way where it's leaking. I mean, I'm old enough
I
to
hear you.
remember all these stories.
No, you're making an interesting point. In general, and Rebero, you know, in the Gemara, sometimes the Tana frequently follows a certain pattern, and we say it's Lishita Sayu. They are consistent. And so, Rebero, I want to say that you are consistent in helping us navigate and connect to the question of, are these leniencies de facto leniencies, or can we apply them as a heter to try to get away? Sorry, I was a bug. To get away with what we want to do. And so generally, there is the default response, my instinctive response, although it warrants more scholarship, is that all of these discussions about, is it biblical, is it rabbinic, is it permissible, it's mostly in the context of de facto, after the fact. Can it be done? Should it be done? Or what do you do if you already messed up? And so generally speaking, these activities that we're saying are prohibited, whether it is a malacha or it's rabbinic, the Gemara is really saying don't do it. But it's a good question. Can we apply? Are there scenarios where we could apply these principles? And it's a good question. I'll tell you, just because you brought it up, an interesting question related to yesterday's Gemara. Yesterday, so we're going to take a momentary detour. So I want to share what this idea, which is related to your question, and then we're going to close off with a discussion about Baina building and what can we infer from this Gemara about building. But first, we spoke yesterday about if you can cut or bite, remove nails on Shabbos. The long story short is just about no. The only scenario where you might be able to remove a nail is if it's mostly hanging off or the skin is mostly hanging off, it's causing you pain and it's in a precise manner, and you do it biyad, you do it with your hand. Otherwise, you really can't. But there is a reference to the fact that removing nails with your hand is only rabbinic. There is a discussion in halachic literature about the following. And Rebero, I think this is along the lines of your lishito sai. This is along the lines of your reasoning, and it's brought in the halachic conversation. Usually, if the chachamim say you're not allowed to do something, then you can't do it. But certain rabbinic prohibitions can sometimes be done via a Gentile with a Gentile, if there's an important need. Now, usually, what would be the important need? And so, interestingly enough, in Jewish law, when a woman goes to the mikvah, so there's a series of steps of preparation that are necessary to go to the mikvah. Why? Because for a person to go to the mikvah, there cannot be any separation between the person, their body, and the water. And there are certain things that create a chatzitza, a separation. And so a person cleans themselves before going to the mikvah so that there's no chatzitza, whether it's, dough or schmutz or whatever they call. Person brushes or combs their hair before going to the mikvah. And another thing a person does before going to the mikvah is cuts their nails, because nails, if they're long or if there's schmutz inside them, could be considered a chatzitza, a separation. And cutting the nails is an essential part of going to the mikvah. So there's a question in halachic literature: what does a person do? They're going to the mikvah on Shabbos, which can be done, but they forgot to cut their nails. And so the question is presented, Rebero's type of question: can you hire a Gentile to cut your nails? Because cutting the nails, depending on how it's done, could be either biblical or rabbinic. If it's rabbinic, can a Gentile cut the nails? And so there's a discussion. Again, I'm not giving you halacha l'maisa about maybe hiring a Gentile to remove a person's nails without using a vessel, without using a kli, without using nail cutters. And it's not certain that it's permissible, but there is such a discussion. And so usually, Rebero, you say, can we use these heter? Can we apply the heter? And usually I say, Rebero, no way. But I want to acknowledge that in halacha, there are several references to some of these instances where you said, can we use this as a heter? And it's discussed. Not typically, but under important mitzvah-related circumstances, there may be some leniency to apply some of the kulas.
We also have the issue of the cuttings of the nail. We want to remove them in case the pregnant woman, etc., etc. I don't want to go there.
Well, that would be a reason not to keep it on. So anyway, so I wanted to share that with, yes, Doctor.
Is there any issue with undoing a braid or removing the blush or the eyeshadow?
That's a very good question. Do me a favor. I just don't want to, this is recorded. I don't want my ignorance to shine. So I would like to get back to you with a researched answer, but it's a good question. Okay. If we're saying that the application is prohibited or the braiding is prohibited. So Dr. Hammer, let me reframe your question. If braiding hair is called bona, is unbraiding called soter? Is that called demolition?
Exactly.
So that's your question. It's a good question. So just to add a little flavor.
Again,
yes.
We can't escape so quickly. So if you're not allowed to comb your hair even with your hand, so let's say a person that wants to just scratch his head and by mistake some hair come out, we have that whole question again, Lamaisa. He didn't need to pull out the hair, he wanted to scratch his head.
Right. So I want to leave like we're still in the middle of a conversation. So I don't want to leave this like this is all the final answer. Bli neder, I think it's going to be tomorrow because I don't know if we're going to have time. I want to take a look in the Shulchan Aruch. Let's see how these ideas in the Gemara are explained and come down in the text that give practical instruction regarding Shabbos observance. So that would be so we're still a little bit on shpilkas. We're still left with some information that's not fully there. So I want to say it's a little shocking to the uninitiated or to those that haven't studied this a while to find a halachic comparison between a braid and bona. But I think it really gets to the definition of bona. And so this Gemara, as much as it's a shocking insight into how one might view braiding hair, it might also be a reverse insight into the definition of bona. And that's what a lot of the commentaries struggle with and work through over here. And so I asked already the question before, and we found this. I found it now here in the sefer that I have over here. The question of, does baina exist in the human experience, on the human person? Can we say that making a person's hair is considered baina? And I already said maybe it's not, and that's why the Rabbanan say it's not biblical. It's not a malacha, because how could you use the word baina? Others apparently seem to believe that there is such a concept as baina with a person. Seems like the Rambam says that. But I want to add one more question, which is related to Dr. Hammer's question, which is, can we infer from this Gemara that temporary construction, not permanent, is also considered baina? And so there are Svarim that quote our Gemara and say, that this Gemara proves that baina l'sha, temporary building, is also considered baina for the purposes of Shabbos. And it seems like the Talmud Yerushalmi makes an explicit statement that yesh baina l'sha, even a temporary structure, a temporary construction can be considered construction. You know why? So, the Mishkan was a temporary structure that was constructed and then taken apart. And so from here, we might be inclined to infer that even temporary structure, temporary building can be halachically classified as building. I want to add again, it's a little bit scholarship, a little bit getting into the weeds, but it's important. The Chassam Sofer, one of the greatest Hungarian scholars and halachic authorities of all time, we might say, he says that actually our Gemara disagrees with the Yerushalmi and believes that there is no halachic temporary construction is not considered a full construction. What would he do with this Gemara is a good question.
I think it makes common sense, because what is temporary? Everything is temporary.
Yeah. No, let's take a moment. Again, we're still in the middle of the. Oh no. This is what I want to do. We're going to end off with the Ben Yoyada. Talks here about the Agada that we shared about Chava getting her hair done. So what exactly? So again, we're for the final moments, we're taking a little bit of a detour. Tomorrow, Bli neder, we'll start off. Remind me if I forget to do this. We'll start off looking in the halachic works of the Shulchan Aruch and alike to get a sense of how this actually trickles down halacha l'maisa. So let's now look in the Ben Yoyada, a story about how Adam, or rather Chava, was constructed, separated from Adam, and the Rabbi Shimon ben Menasya says that Hashem made Chava's hair. Hashem braided Chava's hair. Pirish, the Eisha bara, when Hashem created Chava, Gazar Sheiya Sara Nibra, Kalua Meikara, Hashem decreed that Chava should be born into existence with a braided hair. Her hair shouldn't be undone and then she would have to be braided. Adam Adam, in his first encounter with Chava, should meet her with braided hair, so that she should be put together the moment Adam sees her for the first time. Why was Hashem so eager to make sure that even a superficial, secondary, and not so important facet of her existence should be done bidei shamayim in heaven? It would have been enough that her hair would be compatible with braiding. She should have braided her hair, or Adam could have braided her hair. She should learn how to braid her hair herself. Why was hair braiding something that had to be built into creation? And he says, you know why?
Make it more attractive.
I guess to make a comment that attractiveness is, doctor, maybe you like this. It's a positive. And so Hashem is saying, like we said, like a kala should be made up. This is something that's positive. It's good. It's Hashem is willing to get involved in it. And so it's a reminder that it's acceptable and good. And it's an interesting, because I guess, and I have a feeling the reason why the Ben Yehuda is saying this is he existed in a time where there was probably a lot of debate about asceticism and how much, and I think with other faiths as well, about how to treat women. And so he's making an interesting case, right? In the Islamic world, women who generally were not at all. And so here we see that we're saying that it's a positive. Then he says from the Arizal that generally speaking, Kabbalistically, hair represents judgment. And that's why a person that has saras, for example, and generally a person males cut their hair short and they only leave payas. But because the women and men balance each other out, I'm paraphrasing here. So therefore, if men have to have the hair removed, then women have to have women do keep their hair. That's what he's saying. I'm not sure what we do show this to those that shave their hair. Because he says like this, Isha b'chinas asiyah. The women are the ones who make things happen. They are the world of asiyah, of action. And they need to have hair. Little Kabbalah over here. And that's why women don't shave their hair. On the contrary, they grow hair long. So there should be hair. And now we understand why Hashem wanted that the hair should be braided. To show a symbolic makeover of Gevura, of Din. And because by braiding the hair is being bent, and it's a symbol of breaking the klipa, breaking severity, breaking judgment. And so interesting. So if anyone's wondering, there's a Kabbalistic facet to a hair braid. Take it or leave it. All right, dear friends, this concludes today's Gemara session. It is 11 o'clock. Today we started our discussion about why our Mishnah lists braiding, combing, and eyeshadow as potentially prohibited on Shabbos. To note, the Mishnah gives two opinions, that it is a rabbinic prohibition, that it is a biblical prohibition. Our Gemara tried to understand the relationship between these activities and melachas of Shabbos, but I would say like this, our struggle to connect these activities with actual melacha reflect well on the position that says that they should only be prohibited rabbinically, because there's some association, but it's hard for us to get a solid connection between those melachas. Tomorrow, Bli Neder, we'll start off, before going further in the Gemara, with the halachic angle. We'll take a look in the Shulchan Aruch and the Rambam and see how they present these ideas, halacha l'maisa. And Dr. Hammer, I owe you as well the follow-up of our conversation about if braiding is boina, is undoing soiser. Dr. Pasternak, I do not believe Rabbi Schlomberg is going to be giving a class today, or for anyone else that's joining, I don't believe there's a Chumash class today. Thank you all for being here. Let's have good news, healthy news, happy news, and I look forward to seeing everyone Be'ezer Hashem tomorrow in good health and good circumstances. Yasher Koyach.
Thank you. Enjoy the blue skies.